Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The coffee was lying to him again. Callum Voss held the cup at a slight distance, the way you might hold something that had misrepresented itself at a social gathering, and took a second sip in the hope that the first had simply been a misunderstanding. It had not been. Whatever was inside the cup was warm and brown, and committed to the performance of being coffee without possessing any of its fundamental qualities. And the little printed label on the serving urn had called it Terran Roast Blend, which was, Callum thought, a phrase designed specifically to mean nothing while sounding reassuring. He stood at the eastern edge of Veldris Station's memorial atrium and did not look at the photographs on the display table. This required less effort than it once had, which he supposed was progress of a kind. The atrium was the station's best room, meaning it was the room that the interior design system had been given the largest budget and the least supervision, resulting in a space that was genuinely impressive from 3 specific angles and slightly bewildering from all the others. The ceiling was vaulted, real vaulted, not the projected vaulting that budget stations used. And somewhere in the upper tiers, the atmospheric processors ran with a sound just below hearing that Callum's body registered as a very faint, ongoing sense of significance. Memorial services worked well here. The acoustics caught silence in the way good rooms catch light. About 200 people occupied the space in the careful, dispersed way that people occupy memorial services, close enough to share the weight of the occasion, far enough to retain the privacy of their own specific grief. Veterans in various stages of formal dress clustered in configurations that had clearly self-organized by branch and era. A group of older soldiers near the refreshment table had already discovered the open bar situation and were processing this discovery with the measured solemnity of men who had survived worse and intended to survive this too. One of them was telling a story that made 2 others laugh and then immediately look guilty about laughing, which was the correct sequence. The coalition had sent representatives from 4 species, which meant the translation matrices were working hard. 3 of them were running simultaneously somewhere above the ambient sound, and they occasionally disagreed with each other in ways that sent small ripples of polite confusion through the crowd. A moment of hegemony formal address rendering into human speech about 6 degrees 2 ceremonially, or a Drevari condolence phrase collapsing into a colloquial human equivalent that carried entirely the wrong register. Callum had watched a Drevari dignitary spend 40 seconds in confused silence after his translator converted what was clearly a moving tribute into something approximate to "you had a very nice friend. That's rough." He was 43 years old. His contractor badge identified him as civilian advisory, logistics consultation, and gave his clearance rating in a font small enough to discourage conversation. He had selected the badge's background color, a particularly unambitious gray. With the same care, a different kind of man might apply to choosing an alibi. He had been attending these memorial services for 11 years, which was 4 years fewer than the battle itself had been over, because it had taken him 7 years to be ready to be in the same room as the photographs, and 3 more to stop positioning himself near exits. He was doing well, on the whole. The East Wing announced, through the station's public address system in a tone of sublime institutional indifference, that gravitational calibration in sectors 4 through 7 would be adjusted within the hour and that attendees might experience mild ankle discomfort, and to please remain hydrated. Several people looked briefly upward with the expression of beings who had hoped today would not also include ankle discomfort, and then returned to grieving. Callum finished the coffee. He was deciding whether to commit to a second cup, with the full knowledge that it would lie to him with equal conviction, when the door to the service corridor opened and a woman walked through it. She was tall. That was the first thing. The second thing, following a half-second behind the first like a translator catching up, was that she wore a hegemony officer's sash over a dress uniform, bearing commendations that Callum recognized, and a few that made him adjust his estimation of her rank upward twice in quick succession. The third thing, and he did not particularly invite this observation, it simply arrived, was that she was striking in a way that needed a moment to fully process, because she looked almost human, and the almost was doing enormous work. Her skin held a faint iridescence, barely present in the atrium's careful lighting. Her eyes had a second ring within the pupil, a slow secondary contraction, like a lens deciding. Her hair moved a half-beat after the rest of her, making its own quiet deliberations. She accepted a program from the nearest attendant with a nod that communicated gratitude and a total structural immunity to small talk. Callum watched her for 4 seconds, decided she was someone important enough that eye contact would be a professional miscalculation, and began moving toward the refreshment table, where a man was offering bread rolls with an expression of absolute conviction that this was helping. Behind him, unhurried and with the composed precision of a woman who had attended many of these ceremonies and survived all of them, she began moving toward the display table. The display table had been arranged by someone with good intentions and no particular understanding of how grief moves through a room. The photographs were chronological, which was logical, and placed at eye level, which was considerate, and framed in composite material that was doing its best to suggest permanence without fully committing to it. Small printed cards beneath each image offered names, dates, unit designations, the administrative residue of lives that had been, at some point, considerably more than administrative. The holographic inserts between the framed prints cycled through 3-second archival clips, faces moving for a moment, and then resetting, moving and resetting, which had presumably been designed to feel like memory and instead felt like watching people get interrupted repeatedly at the worst possible moment. Tessari Veth moved along the table with the measured attention she brought to all things she had decided deserved it. She had attended 14 coalition memorial services in 11 years, not counting the hegemony's own ceremonies, which operated on a different ceremonial calendar and involved a collective grief process that her species conducted through a formal biological sequence lasting several days, none of which translated particularly well into the standing around with beverages format that humans preferred. She had learned to move through these events the way she moved through difficult terrain, with deliberation, with economy, without letting the surface conditions decide her footing. She read each placard. She acknowledged each photograph. She did not rush. Behind her, the service continued in the way memorial services continue, speeches building toward conclusions that arrived with the structural relief of land after open water, the translation matrices working overhead with the tireless commitment of systems that did not know how to be moved by anything and were therefore never distracted. At the refreshment table, one of the older veterans was now mid-story, something about a forward position and a malfunctioning navigation unit, and the men around him were laughing in the specific register of people laughing at something that had not been funny at the time and had become funny only through the long alchemical pressure of survival. Tessari found she did not dislike this sound. It was honest in a way that formal addresses rarely were. She reached the Hellion Ridge section of the display. She knew it before she read the placard, the way you know a room you have studied in blueprints, not from familiarity but from knowledge, which is a different and in some ways colder thing. She had read every declassified tactical document relating to the engagement. She had attended 2 academic conferences where the battle had been analyzed with the focused enthusiasm that military historians reserved for actions that defied their existing models. She had sat in the back of a lecture hall on Tura Station 3 years ago and listened to a human professor explain the defensive positioning decisions with a tone of barely contained reverence. And she had not told anyone in the room that she had been 14 years old on the last transport out of the evacuation corridor, that her mother had held her hand so tightly on the boarding ramp that she had bruises for a week, that her grandmother, who had survived 4 prior upheavals in her long and stubborn life, had looked back once at the ridge before the transport sealed and said something in their home language that Tessari had not understood then and understood completely now. She knew the tactical record. She did not know the faces. The Meridian database collapse of 2387 had taken the human military's personnel files from that period along with a significant portion of the coalition's shared historical record, and what remained was mostly structural. Formations, coordinates, timing, the geometry of survival without its human content. She had never seen photographs of the soldiers who held Hellion Ridge. The hegemony's own after-action classification had listed the defending force as total loss, which was accurate in the way that a word can be accurate while being entirely insufficient. Her hand found the frame before she had consciously decided to pick it up. It was a wide group shot, slightly overexposed, the kind of image a field camera produced when pointed into ambient light without adjustment. The soldiers in it were not posing exactly. They were arrayed in the approximate shape of a posed photograph, which was different, and several of them had clearly just been doing something else when the camera appeared. Some were mid-sentence. One was eating. A man near the center had his eyes closed in the manner of someone who had blinked at precisely the wrong moment and was going to be gently mocked about it for years. In the back row, slightly elevated on what appeared to be a supply crate, a younger man was looking directly at the lens with the expression of someone who had just made the person beside him laugh, and was still pleased about it, open, unhurried, present in the way that people are present in the hours before something large arrives. She had studied the command structure of the Hellion Ridge engagement for 15 years. She knew the build, she knew the jaw, she knew the particular angle of attention in the eyes, even without the scar that now ran from the left temple to the corner of the mouth. Even without the 15 years that sat in the posture of the man, standing 20 meters away looking at a bread roll, with the expression of someone making a very low-stakes strategic decision. Her hands did not move. Her body did not move. The photograph did not move. Around her, the ambient sound of the room dropped by half a degree, the way it does when something in a space has shifted without anyone being able to identify what. Nearby conversations became slightly more cautious. A woman to her left took a small step back without knowing why. Across the atrium, at the refreshment table, Callum Voss registered the change in the room the way he registered most changes, through the peripheral system that 15 years of civilian life had not fully decommissioned, and turned. He saw a tall woman in a hegemony dress uniform holding a photograph with both hands and not moving. He could not yet see which photograph. He took one step forward, and then stopped, and in the space between those two actions, recognized something in the angle of her stillness that sent a very specific and very familiar signal through every part of him that had spent 15 years carefully not receiving signals of this kind. The bread roll remained in his hand. He did not notice this. She turned her head. The part of Callum that had survived Hellion Ridge by making fast decisions in bad conditions noted, briefly and without judgment, that the service corridor door was 11 meters to his left and appeared unobstructed. He did not move toward it. He was going to have to think about why later. Her eyes found him across the room with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. She walked toward him the way senior officers walk toward things they have decided to address, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular velocity of someone for whom hesitation is a resource to be spent deliberately. The crowd parted in the unconscious way crowds part for people carrying a certain quality of intent, and the conversations nearest to Callum's position did not stop exactly, but became quieter versions of themselves. The way music turns down when something on the other side of the room requires attention. Callum did not move. This was less composure than it appeared. His feet had made a unilateral decision, and the rest of him was working around it. She stopped at a distance that was, by human social convention, one step closer than a greeting and one step further than a confrontation, which was either diplomatic precision or the translation matrix's best guess at appropriate proximity. And for a moment neither of them said anything. The station's public address system chose this interval to remind all attendees that the East Wing remembrance candles were biologically sourced and should not be consumed, which had apparently been a necessary clarification at some prior event, and which landed in the silence between them with exquisite timing. She said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to and no further, "Are you the commander who held Hellion Ridge?" It was not quite a question. It had the grammatical structure of a question and the weight of a verdict. Callum looked at her. He looked at the photograph she was still holding, which he could now see clearly, and recognized the back row, recognized the supply crate, recognized the particular angle of a younger version of himself looking at a camera in the hours before everything. He looked back at her. His contractor badge, sensing nothing, continued to identify him as civilian advisory, logistics, and said nothing helpful. "That photograph," he said, "is from a closed military archive." "Yes," she said. "The Memorial Committee received a physical print from a private collection last month. There are no digital copies." She paused. You are not answering my question. I'm contextualizing. Her secondary iris contracted slightly. He had no framework for what this meant and filed it under information pending. Around them, the memorial service had developed a radius of discretion. The people nearby had not moved away, but had found other directions to face with great conviction, the way witnesses to something private become very interested in the middle distance. The veteran from the refreshment table was still telling his story, now apparently reaching a section involving a navigation error of some magnitude, and his audience's laughter provided a buffer of sound that Callum was quietly grateful for. He said finally, "What unit were you with?" "I was 14, she said. "I was on the last civilian transport out of the evacuation corridor, 40 minutes before the line collapsed. The 40 minutes landed the way specific numbers land when they belong to a moment you have carried, not as information, but as confirmation." Callum knew the 40 minutes. He had spent 15 years not thinking about the 40 minutes with the focused consistency of a man who thought about very little else. "My family was on that transport," she said. "My parents, my younger sibling. My grandmother, who should not have survived the boarding process and did so through a combination of stubbornness and misdirected elbow." She held the photograph slightly forward, not offering it, simply acknowledging it. "I have been trying to find the commanding officer of the Hellion Ridge Defense for 11 years. The personnel records from that period were lost in the Meridian collapse. The hegemony's classification listed the defending force as total loss." A pause. "You are listed as dead." "Bureaucratically," Callum said, "it's been an ongoing situation." She looked at him with the expression of a person recalibrating. "You find this humorous." "I find it very manageable," he said. "Are you hungry? There's a man over there with bread rolls who I think has found his purpose." She did not look at the bread roll man. She kept looking at Callum with the steady, measuring attention of someone who had prepared for several versions of this conversation, and was discovering that none of them had included the bread rolls. The translation matrix above them, running on the ceremonies public channel, chose this moment to render a fragment of their conversation, caught somehow in the ambient feed, and convert it into Dravari formal register, producing a phrase that the nearest Dravari attendee received as an official announcement that a significant logistical reclassification had occurred, which was, in its way, not entirely wrong. Callum said, "Ask me what you need to ask." Something in Tessari Veth's posture shifted by a degree that was small in measurement and considerable in meaning. She had commanded divisions. She had navigated 17 years of coalition politics in which every sentence carried weight she was accountable for. She was not, as a general principle, a person who required a moment. She required a moment. "The soldiers who held the ridge," she said. "I know the tactical record. I know what they did and when and at what cost. I have read the geometry of that 18 hours until I could reconstruct it without notes." Her voice remained level with the particular effort of a voice that has decided to remain level. "I don't know who they were. I don't know their names. The database collapse took everything that wasn't strategic classification." She looked at him steadily. "You know their names." Callum was quiet for long enough that the veteran's story reached its apparent conclusion somewhere behind them, producing a burst of laughter that rose and settled like something released. He looked at the photograph in her hands. He looked at the faces in the back row, the ones that had been mid-sentence, the ones that had been eating, the man near the center who had blinked at exactly the wrong moment and was going to be gently mocked about it for years. "Yes," he said, "I know their names. They found the bench the way people find things they needed without knowing they were looking, through a series of small, sideways decisions that each seemed reasonable on their own." Tessari had moved first, not toward the exit, but toward the observation window at the atrium's far edge. And Callum had followed because the alternative was standing in the middle of a memorial service, holding a bread roll, while a woman who had spent 11 years looking for him walked away. And that felt like a poor final chapter to a story he hadn't chosen to be in but was in nonetheless. The bench was narrow and designed for solitary contemplation, which meant two people sitting on it were in closer proximity than either had negotiated, but neither of them moved to increase the distance. Outside the observation window, Veldris Station's exterior dock array conducted its slow, enormous commerce. A cargo loader the size of a small geographic feature made a transit across the glass. its running lights blinking with the indifferent patience of something that had never heard of Hellion Ridge and was not going to start now. Callum told her their names. He told her in the order he remembered them, which was not alphabetical and not by rank, but by the particular sequence in which they had become real to him, which is to say the order in which he had learned the small things, the complaints about ration quality, the photographs kept in breast pockets, the specific ways different people filled silence during the hours when silence needed filling. He told her about Sergeant Yale Domies, who had maintained a running philosophical argument with the ridge's geology for the entire 18 hours, and had made points that Callum, in retrospect, found difficult to refute. He told her about Pieter Vance, who had brought a book that he did not read but held in his left hand throughout the engagement like a talisman, and who had said, at hour 11, that he was not afraid, but his hands were confused about the situation. He told her about the others, each one, and Tessari listened with the whole quality of attention that very few people are capable of, the kind that does not plan its response while receiving information, but simply receives it. The station's memorial tone sounded once above them. The 15-minute acoustic interval that had been designed to evoke reverence and mostly evoked the sensation of being inside a very expensive clock, and neither of them acknowledged it. At some point, her secondary iris contracted and did not fully return to its resting state, and Callum had spent enough time in the last hour reading the physical vocabulary of her face to understand what this meant without needing it explained. He looked at the cargo loader moving past the window and gave her the privacy of his peripheral attention, which was the best he had to offer and which, he thought, she accepted. She told him about her sibling, Rithais Veth, who had been 7 years old on the evacuation transport and had spent the journey asking questions that their mother had answered with the creative dishonesty of a parent trying to outpace a child's perception of disaster. Rithais, who had grown up in the years after the evacuation to become a theoretical physicist working on faster-than-light corridor mapping, which was work that required a specific combination of precision and imagination, and which, as Tessari delivered this information with the careful neutrality of someone presenting a fact and not a weight, Callum understood to mean that a person who existed in the world, because of what happened on that ridge, had spent their life building roads through impossible distances. He sat with this for a long time. They would have found that extremely satisfying, he said finally. The corridor mapping, Yale especially, she had opinions about distance. Tessari's expression moved in a direction that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, and was perhaps the place where those two things negotiate their shared border. I would like to have met her. She would have argued with you about your defensive grid formations, Callum said. She argued with everyone about their defensive grid formations. She was nearly always right, which made it worse. Tessari was quiet for a moment. I also have opinions about the defensive grid formations. I wrote a paper. Callum looked at her. What kind of paper? A peer-reviewed paper, she said, with a composure that was doing considerable work, in which I argued that the southeastern anchor positioning in hour 7 was a tactical error that succeeded through geographic circumstance rather than command judgment. The particular feeling of sitting across from someone who had studied the worst 18 hours of your life with the rigorous enthusiasm of an academic and had published findings was, Callum discovered, not a feeling he had previously catalogued. It landed somewhere between being haunted and being graded. I was working with degraded sensor data and 2 broken communications relays in hour 7, he said. I noted the degraded sensors, she said. I concluded they explain the decision without excusing it. I see. The paper received strong reviews. I'm very pleased for the paper, Callum said, and something in the flatness of his delivery cracked whatever had been holding the tension in the bench, and Tessari Veth, High Field Commander of the 3rd Outer Reach Division, produced a sound that was brief and genuine and clearly surprised her slightly. And Callum found that the tightness that had been living behind his sternum for approximately 3 hours had decreased by an amount he couldn't have predicted and was not going to examine too carefully in case it stopped. The ceremony concluded somewhere behind them. They could hear the formal close, a multilingual benediction delivered in 3 languages and 2 translation matrices, which produced a 4th version that was technically none of them and spiritually perhaps the most accurate. And then the room began its gradual, gentle dissolution into smaller conversations, and the comfortable noise of people preparing to carry their grief back out into ordinary life. Callum reached into his jacket and produced a contact card, the physical kind, because his contractor grade didn't include a communications chip, and he had never corrected this because he had not until today anticipated needing one, and held it out. Tessari took it with the two-fingered hegemony formal grip that indicated receipt of something significant, which he suspected she applied to most things out of habit, and which he nonetheless noted. She produced her own from a uniform pocket, a card that communicated, through its material alone, a security clearance that made his contractor badge look like a library membership. He took it. They stood. The logistics of departure organized themselves with a kind of tact, the way endings do when the people involved have decided without discussion that the ending should be handled carefully. Tessari straightened her uniform, replaced her gloves, and then went still in the way she went still when she had something to say and was deciding the precise weight she wanted it to carry. The cargo loader outside had completed its transit. The dock was quiet, the stars behind it unchanged and indifferent and very old. In the 14th hour, she said, there was a child on the perimeter, a child who had not made the transport. Your soldiers found her on the ridge, and one of them held her against the wall so she could sleep. She did not look away from him. He waved the last of the transports through with his left hand. The field camera on the transport recorded it. I have watched it many times. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. He was using his left hand because she had fallen asleep against his right arm and he did not want to wake her. Callum said nothing. The dock said nothing. The stars, predictably, said nothing. Tessari nodded once, the short, complete nod of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver and is at peace with the delivery, and walked back into the atrium, into the dispersing crowd, into the ordinary noise of a day that had decided to be more than ordinary and was now slowly returning to itself. Callum sat back down on the narrow bench. Outside the window, a new loader was beginning its crossing, unhurried and vast, its running lights blinking their patient, indifferent rhythm against the dark. He watched it move. He thought about Yale, who would have argued with the ridge. He thought about Pieter and his book and his honest hands. He thought about a child who had slept against his arm through the last hours of the longest night of his life, and whom he had not thought about, carefully and consistently, for 15 years, because some things you do not open unless someone hands you the key. The bench was still too narrow for one person to sit comfortably on, which was a design failure that Callum thought he could live with. He sat there for a while. The dark outside held its ground, the way dark does. The station breathed around him, processing and recirculating, keeping everything alive through systems too vast and too patient to need acknowledgement. Somewhere behind him, the man with the bread rolls was presumably still finding his purpose. After a while, Callum put the contact card in his pocket, next to